Welcome, everybody. Today we are speaking with Dr. Stephen Knoblauch, and he is an internationally recognized clinician, teacher, and lecturer on psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. He is the author of The Musical Edge of Therapeutic Dialogue in Bodies and Social Rhythms, Navigating Unconscious Vulnerability and Emotional Fluidity. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to jump into the topic about the intersection of music, psychology, and mental health, and would love to hear your perspective on how these things integrate together. So thank you for joining me.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. A quick bio sketch. I grew up in a working class town in all kinds of ways, whether it was sports, walking to unfamiliar neighborhoods. Very early in life, I had to become aware of my body and how I carried it, and also the bodies of others. As young kids, we'd be scrappy, and you had to be aware of danger, and you had to be able to read a person's body, how they moved, their eyes, their facial expressions, the tone of voice. And I didn't pay any attention to that because I had nothing to compare it to. It was just the way of life. And, I did fine in that world. I think that was an early preparation for attention to dynamics of tone and rhythm, not only in how people speak, but in how people move and interact. I became more and more interested in music as a young person. I studied the piano. Didn't really think I was going anywhere with it. I mean, as a little boy, a young boy, I played some piano recitals with all the other students of my teacher. But it was about in my teenage years that having grown up in New Jersey and being just a path train away from Greenwich Village, I got really interested in jazz and R&B. In particular, I was able to kind of just, pop a few cents into a turnstile. And in a few minutes, I was walking around in one of the music capitals of the world. In those days, in the 1960s, you could walk along the street and bump into Bob Dylan or, Ornette Coleman, jazz musicians, rock and blues musicians. I was able to kind of go over and hear all the bands, Coltrane, Sonny Rollins, Miles Davis. In fact, the first band I ever heard, I was 14 years old. I snuck into the Village Vanguard to hear Miles Davis.
Oh my gosh.
I remember going up to him, as a pimply little kid in between sets, and he was talking to somebody, and I said, "Mr. Davis, I just want to shake your hand. I think you're the greatest jazz trumpet player in the world." And he was very sweet. He was very sweet. He took me very serious, and he was very sweet. By the time I was 16, I decided I wanted to get having heard that music, I said, "How do you do that? I want to learn how to do that."
Mm-hmm.
And I started studying the saxophone both with a teacher and listening to the radio and records and practicing and getting practice books. Eventually got into a career, and I won't go into the details of that because that's not what I'm here for, but I played for about 5 years, in different bands, and my life shifted, and I won't go into the details of that, but I got more involved in the community. I spent 17 years in community mental health. I remember as an undergraduate in college, I didn't like what I saw happening to my peers who were in psychotherapy or psychoanalysis. I thought it made them dependent. I thought it undermined their trust in themselves. But after 17 years of community mental health, I happened to start working in a clinic where I met somebody who worked for several years to convince me to go into training, and I did. The early childhood experience in tough neighborhoods, then playing music. The thing about jazz that's relevant to this is that you're improvising. There's a structure, but you're improvising. And in order to do that in a band, even when, I played in blues or rock or world music bands,
Yeah.
you have to listen to the other musicians. It's not even that you have to, you just do. And you're responding to each other. So if you're playing in a certain way, the drummer and the bass player are going to adjust to that. If they're playing a certain way, I'm going to adjust to them. So there's a constant nonverbal, rhythmic and tonal conversation going on among peers. And we're making music and we're taking it emotionally into different places. As I got into psychoanalytic training, part of my training was with Beatrice Beebe, who is quite well known for her research on infants and their caregivers. And I also eventually got to be friendly and collegial with Dan Stern, who was her mentor, and who was quite well known for his work, videotaping mothers and infants interacting. And the things that we really had in common, Dan's real big interest outside of psychoanalysis was dance, and was looking at the way that we communicate with each other without words,
Yeah.
particularly, of course, with mothers and infants during the first 18 months or so. You have no choice. I came to realize that so much gets communicated emotionally, affectively, uh, between people without even anything being said or formulated. And there's on an emotional dimension a kind of knowing which is pre-representational or non-representational. It's more emotional than cognitive, than rationality. And of course, psychoanalysis is very interested in unconscious meanings, unconscious communications. And very often, when you start paying attention to these dimensions of our interaction, you recognize things about what's going on between you and another person, which suggests something about what they're experiencing emotionally. And so at times, it might be the tone of voice, it might be how their eyes move either directly in contact with me or away from me. It might be head movement, it might be something in the way they hold their body. But there's a way in which, on a embodied level, where the expression comes out in terms of rhythm and prosody or tonality. There's either an emotional experience of the other that is consistent with what they're saying, if they're talking about being fearful or confused, angry or afraid, or inconsistent. They may be in denial of something or misreading their own experience, misrepresenting. Now, I think that in psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic psychotherapy, there's always a tension between people wanting to be recognized and wanting to recognize another or recognize their own experience and not, which you might capture with the word opacity. Many people want to be opaque. They don't want to be seen or understood. Sometimes it's a conscious thing. And of course, what is often of significance for those of us working with people who come into therapy is that it's unconscious. So somebody will come in and say, I don't know what's wrong with me. I mean, most of the time, people will say what they think is wrong with them, but they'll use cliches like I'm depressed or I'm anxious or I'm having a hard time in this relationship. It's a beginning, but to understand exactly how that gets constructed, what elicits those feelings, how accurate those words are to what the person is experiencing. Well, that comes from being together and seeing how we use words and where we go in our explorations. And part of what is always present, even as you and I interact, are the things that we're aware of, the dimensions of our awareness, and then there are things that we're not aware of about ourselves and about the other. And the wonderful thing about the levels of what I call the musical edge of therapeutic dialogue or the
Mm-hmm.
musical dimension, the rhythm and the tone, is that it often reveals a lot more to me or even to the other person, patient, about what's going on for them emotionally. And I would say that that's basically the understanding and the practice that has shaped all of the clinical examples, the clinical vignettes that I describe in my book. And I like to use a lot of vignettes. Sometimes I have to disguise the person, make them a kind of amalgam. Sometimes I'll do it with permission. I think it's really helpful to have illustrations, even though when we write and we describe and we speak, we're obviously reducing the complexity of the dimension.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
But I tried to write in a different way about my experiences with a focus on my experience of my patients rhythms and tonality, and my experience of their experience of mine.
Yeah. That's really interesting. It's interesting to think about it from a clinician's standpoint. The these musical elements, almost like an orchestra, is happening in the room with different things. So, this idea of a third person in the room, which really just might be the clinician thinking outside of themselves always about this dynamic that's happening between patient and therapist or psychotherapist, and how this orchestra can occur with, yes, tonality, body movement, reactions, emotions, and that they all play a really specific piece that comes together to create whatever it might be, which is really fascinating that you found a way that these things kind of merge together to make this connection, to make it easier for clinicians to understand, and maybe even to, do you ever bring this up with patients to kind of help them understand sometimes what's happening, or is this something more specific for clinicians typically?
Well, like everything, sometimes I bring it up, and sometimes I don't need to. You
Okay.
know,
Hmm.
sometimes I can just resonate with it, and I feel that a patient needs to slow down or to avoid something. I then will decide whether to question it, to bring it to their attention, or to just go with it, and with the trust that this is where we need to be today. It would be great to talk about that, but not yet, or not today. And I think the idea that you brought forth, the metaphor of an orchestra, is it's a little bit more accurate than the third person. It's more like the room is filled with many different voices, and those voices have to do with our families, our social contexts. Certain people bring the tradition of having grown up in the South or in the city or in the suburbs, coming from a certain ethnic background. You just try to stay open. I just try to stay open to when those seem to emerge as having significant meaning. Sometimes it's not so significant. That's the good thing about doing, long-term therapy. As you work with a person over weeks, months, and even years, you become familiar with certain themes, just like you do in music.
Yeah.
Like you can listen to a recording and say, "Oh, that's Taylor Swift." In the first 5 seconds. I mean, I can tell you in the first 5 seconds, that's John Coltrane or that's Sonny Rollins. You know, those were my heroes.
Oh, yeah.
Some of them, not all of them. Those were two of the major ones.
Sure.
And there's a way in which, over time, we get to recognize things just from small cues. One of the things you recognize, using the metaphor of the orchestra, is that there are many ancestors in the room. Often, the influence of somebody's mother or their father or their brother or sister, or a mentor, a coach, a teacher, a grandparent. And I think maybe the most interesting thing is sometimes you have what we call cross generational transmissions. And that term is also is often used with the idea of trauma. So it's cross generational transmission of trauma. I use an example of my own, which to illustrate this. I have this habit, which I've had as long as I can remember, of when I wake up in the morning, first thing I do is, I brush my teeth and get ready, is put on the radio. And when the radio, I can remember times when the radio didn't work because the batteries went out or something, for whatever reason. Um, it would make me very anxious. And I really needed to have that radio on, which didn't make any sense. And I lived that way until about 20 years ago or so. I think at one point I was speaking with my mother when she was still alive, and
Mm.
she told me how my grandfather, when my father and his brothers were in the World War II, would always wake up early in the morning and go down into the kitchen and turn on the radio to hear what's going on because he was worried about his sons. And he wanted to, hear the news about the war. Now, when I was about 2, 3 years old, I used to get up early in the morning and go downstairs to find my grandfather in the kitchen listening to the radio. And so we would sit there and he would make me a little bite to eat. And we would sit there and listen to the radio. Of course, I didn't know what I was listening to. I was 2, 3 years old. But I could sense in his body the importance of that radio as a kind of anxiety reducer. Somehow I absorbed that and just continued that ritual without knowing anything about its meaning or its origins. So I
Wow.
use that as an example of how sometimes we discover in the work, and it could be through tones, tone of voice, or the rhythm of a person's exchange, that what's going on is is influenced by some kind of cross generational transmission of trauma or otherwise.
Wow.
I would say that the example I give is my grandfather's trauma, his ongoing fear that he was going to lose his children. Um,
Right.
so sorting that out takes a while, and of course, it's always nice to not only have the rhythm and the tone, but also be able to talk about it. So I'm not presenting this as a substitute for talking and wondering and questioning and interpreting times. Although I see interpretation not as the critical thing we do, but it's just one tool in the kit bag. It often gets used too quickly or too often. I think in a good therapeutic relationship, these meanings, they just emerge as we interact. We recognize, hey, this is what we do all the time, isn't it? I wonder what that means, kind of thing. You know.
Yeah. Yeah. And they show up on their own through time, through connection, through communication. Yeah. Which is really kind of a beautiful thing in psychotherapy is this connection that can happen with two people in a room, which can feel very intimate. You're close, you're talking, you're paying attention closely to each other, and to notice patterns and rhythm of how they're speaking and even what's happening to you, right? Your own reaction to what's occurring in the room if something's going on with them, and recognizing that as well.
Well, you bring up again another important part of the work, which is not anything that's unique to me, that I've created or innovated, but it's just essential to working with people, and that's that the words that originally came out of Freud's work were transference and countertransference. What he meant by that, well, I think countertransference was an idea that developed not initially by Freud, but it came out. It sort of fits with the transference. Transference is the idea that as you develop a relationship with somebody, they have expectations of ways of relating to you, which are repetitions of the past. And the way we sometimes talk about that is they treat us like we're their mother or
Mm-hmm.
the mother or the good guy or the bad guy.
Right.
And the countertransference idea is that we have the same experiences. I might experience you like a gal I went to high school with, or like my mother, like my sister, or something like that, without knowing it necessarily. But ultimately, we end up enacting something that is familiar to us. A familiar script is what the family therapists often use to describe it. In that script, we have certain roles and we have certain things that we do in response to each other. And often what happens in that relationship is we're enacting that script and then somebody violates the expectation. You're supposed to be understanding. Why aren't you showing some emotional response to me? Those little breaks in the script, which often are indicated or cued by rhythm or tonal shifts, they also could be shifts in meaning. But more often, they show up initially as some kind of rhythmic break or tonal shift. Those cues are so important because they help us to understand why we do things and why we don't do things. And that's, of course, essential to the work that we do in psychotherapy, helping another person to understand themselves. And we use ourselves, how they experience us and how we experience them, as part of that. We call that, in relational psychoanalysis, we call that enactment.
Mm-hmm.
Enactment is something that I think more and more therapists are paying attention to. What are we playing out here? What's the scene? We live in a world like of screens, movies and TV shows. So we can think of scripts and we can think of enactments and we can think of ourselves in the way that maybe people couldn't 100 years ago. That becomes a really important part. And just as in acting, sometimes, it's the way the person lowers their head, looks at you, the way they say something. And if you're a director, you say, no, 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 don't do it again this way. Do it. We don't even realize as the audience that what we see is something really planned, and there's a certain way that they're saying it or doing it.
Yeah.
And that nonverbal gesture speaks thousands of words, right?
As can music. As can music do the same thing.
Exactly. It's the musical dimension, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
As
Yeah.
can music, which is pretty amazing. Yeah, that the connection between this discovery with each other and the discovery that happens within music and just making that connection is really special. I mean, to be able to see how the two integrate, how they can relate to each other, even the language that is used, like rhythm and tonality, and yeah, those things are very special things to recognize, even within the psychotherapy space, within the room with somebody.
And they trigger powerful emotional experiences often. I mean, there are certain tunes or even certain phrases, that your favorite artist, will play, um, or that comes from a certain tune. It just makes you feel in a certain way, excites you, or it relaxes you. And we do that with each other. And often it comes out unexpectedly. And when it comes out unexpectedly, it's kind of a gift because
Mhm.
then we're learning something that we didn't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, a gift, and it can go back and forth. It's reciprocal. It's reciprocated. This gift that can go back and forth, which music feels that way as the musician can feel that way, almost like you're giving gifts to someone else. You're offering something, right? And the audience feels like they're receiving a gift and giving when they react or are having some kind of emotional response. So it's amazing that we can see that within psychotherapy as well.
Well, you and I are both performers. You sing,
Yes.
and I play saxophone for the most part, sometimes percussion. And we know there's a constant unspoken conversation between ourselves and the audience when we're performing live because we will play a note or a phrase and we immediately can get a sense from the audience. People will they'll go, yeah, or people will cheer. I mean,
Yes.
I was sitting with a group. This almost 77-year-old guy still gets to play with the young folks, playing at a club near where I live. And I knew the bass player. I'd worked with him, and he said, bring the saxophone by. So I came up and joined them for one tune. And there was a way in which all of a sudden I knew what the audience want. I played like a couple phrases, and all of a sudden you hear this, you're in the middle of playing your music, but you hear this response and you feel this response. And same thing with the rhythm. I'm playing along, and all of a sudden there were several drummers. Had a regular drummer, and then they had two African drummers. They would start playing certain, accents, certain, rhythms with certain accents, and it shaped my playing. And then I echoed, and then we ended up sort of having a kind of conversation, and and everybody was loving it. But of course, I had no idea this was going to happen. If you go back and look at the videotape, which there isn't any of, but if there were, you would say, well, how much did the audience make that happen? How much did the drummers make that happen? How much did I make that happen? And we all contributed because we were responding on that level of music, on that level of rhythm and tone to each other, and it was creating emotional experiences for us. And I think that we know that as musicians, and that's a helpful thing. You don't have to be a great musician to be a great therapist, but you can at least know that there's that dimensionality there, offering a potential richness of understanding and connection in your work with your patients.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that perspective when it comes to the clinical aspect. And then as a performer too, these really amazing experiences. And it's so true when you're on stage, you can hear the audience. You don't have to look. You don't have to look at them. You don't have to, say anything to them. The instrument or your voice in a different way is communicating more than probably you could ever say in words. And so to have their reaction back to you can just bring so much light to you, which then is reciprocated. It's really just an amazing interaction that can
Yeah.
happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And sometimes you're sharing all this excitement and playing all these things, and other times you're just creating a lot of space
Mm.
and letting, the note or the rhythm sort of hang in the air, and everybody's kind of holding their breath. And you can't explain those things.
No, no, you can't. They just happen. They can happen organically. They're surprise. And then that's a gift again. These little gifts that show up that
Yeah.
create really wonderful moments. So I think this would be a really great transition into discussing how you think from your perspective and your experiences as a performer and your experiences as a psychotherapist, how you think music can be healing, is healing, and kind of this magic sometimes I feel like music holds. What can you share about your thoughts and your ideas around that?
Well, there's no question that, unless we have a very powerful traumatic history, which makes it difficult for us to allow ourselves to consciously register our emotions in our body, which some people have had, that we don't realize because we're so socialized by how we, all the rhythms of life and the routines that we do every day, wherever we grow up in the city or the country, whether we drive or walk to work or take a train, all of these different things that we do, we pay a lot more attention to our social rituals, of which the most important, or one of the most important, is our language, as you and I are now communicating and understanding each other in the English language. What we don't give as much attention to is how much we really are guided by our body's registration of safety, danger, attraction, repulsion, how much we get on a subway, for example, if we live in a city and we sort of are drawn to stand in one part of the subway or avoid somebody in another one. All these very kind of embodied cues about safety and comfort, attraction, repulsion. It's not just between people, but it's around anything. Why do we decide where we're going to take our lunch if we work in a place where we have to go out to lunch? Why do we go to one place versus the other? Why do we prefer pizza to tuna? There are all these ways in which our body is constantly registering and shaping our thoughts and our activity. And of course, that's because our body is constantly in interaction with our environment, mostly our social environment, but even physical environment, weather and traffic, things like
Mhm.
that. But we live our lives so much out of our emotions and through our emotions. Even here, as you and I interact, we're not hostile to each other. We're not distrustful of each other. We don't look down on each other
Right.
because of our ethnicity or our gender or our age. And that all gets expressed through our body and through our emotional experience of ourselves in the context, in the presence of each other. And we never think about that. I mean, at times we're forced to, but probably 90 to 95 or maybe even 98% of the time, we don't reflect on how that really shapes our judgment. That
Hmm.
shapes what we like, what we don't like, what we repeat, what we avoid. And I think that's a really important aspect of how we experience life and how we should understand our own experiences. And I've called out the musical edge of experience, or I've called it the musical edge of therapeutic dialogue because I write about how that happens in treatment. But it's really true throughout life. You get out of your car and you walk to the supermarket, you walk through the supermarket, and so much of what shapes how you feel and what you do is your environment. Somebody might be over there looking at things, you go, oh, avocados. That's a good idea, Or you go past the berries, berries smell sweet. I wasn't thinking of getting berries, but I think I'll get berries. You know, and there are all kinds of ways in which we don't realize we're not reasoning, or we're sensing our way through the world through our body. We sense that woman is so nice, she smiles, and she asks me, if I want to do this or this. She's just packing the groceries and taking your money or your credit card. But then there's the other woman that's like, what's wrong with her? She seems so ornery. Or the guy, packing your bags. It doesn't seem like he really wants to be there. He's not happy, or he doesn't like me for some reason. Gee, I remember when I worked in a grocery store. I guess I was resentful of a lot of the people who had the money to pay for the groceries, and I was working hard just to get by. There are all these things that we sense and know without even speaking.
Yeah. And music can play that role in many ways. We sense it, our body and our brain, because there's obviously this direct connection between mind and body. And it's amazing how music, we can feel what sadness feels like through song, through notes that are just strung together in a particular way, or like you mentioned earlier, a hanging note. A note that's just hanging on a certain amount of time can make us feel angst, can make us feel anticipation for something, right? This anticipatory anxiety, or maybe joy with a resolve.
Right? It could make us feel like we never want to let go.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Hold
yeah.
that note forever.
Exactly. Yeah. And so there's, like you said, there's an amazing way that we as human beings have a way of sensing things without spoken language.
And that's what I call the musical edge or the musical dimension of and of course, I use that term almost synonymous with embodied because it's within our body. It's as a body that we resonate with that music. We hear it, we feel it. If you go to a carnival in Brazil, you
Mhm.
feel the drums. I mean,
Yeah.
you don't just hear them. They make your body shake. You're just filled with the excitement and the propulsion of the rhythms. And they
Mhm.
could be slow walking rhythms, and you feel that, or they could be powerful, and you just can't stay still. You have to start doing the samba.
Yeah, yeah, you have to start moving. Was there a time where you were in a particular mood or you felt a certain way, and then once you turned on a song or you went and played live, you realized later how much better you felt, or you realized there was something happening before in hindsight? You're like, wow, I really wasn't feeling well before that performance, but now I feel better. Can you recall a time where maybe that happened with music?
Hundreds of times.
Yeah.
And sometimes because of, as any musician, I think, you and I being two examples, learns, you can recognize that happens and say, you know what, I need to stop. After the next patient, I got 44 minutes. I'm going to go sit at the keyboard and just play some 6/9 chords because I'm just going to play some things that make me feel a certain way. And you just do that. You just play a couple long notes. You hear that beautiful sound of your voice or your instrument, and you're all of a sudden your heart rate changes, your pulse changes, your thinking changes, your your muscle relax. It's a form of I think music can be a form of healing. I don't mean just like healing cancer or something like. I mean it's what you were talking about. You can reduce your tension. You can let go of your fear or your sadness and just be calm
Yeah.
or be energized.
Yes, yeah, it can do either, which is amazing. And even in films, it can create fear. It can create anxiety. What I think of as like a horror film.
This fellow who wrote all that music for Star Wars, what's
Oh
his
my gosh. Yeah, exactly. I mean, just can make things feel grand. And again, it's all feel. The key word in that is it makes you feel. There's so much emotion that comes through music, and I do think it can be very healing in lots of different ways, not only for the person who's receiving the music, the audience member, the person who's listening, but for a person who's making or creating music or writing. It can feel cathartic and therapeutic in that way as well, I think.
I think that's true. I mean, I think that, for me, playing music is almost like what for some people praying is. I come away from, I go into it and come away from it knowing that I've kind of refueled. I can remember when I was young and used to take that train across into New York and go to the clubs to hear the different jazz musicians. I feel like I was so lucky. I mean, I lived in the day when I could hear Thelonious Monk, I could hear Charlie Mingus, I could hear Sonny Rollins, I could hear John Coltrane. They were right there, for $3 or $4 or $5. I could go in, and I wasn't sitting in a balcony, with thousands of seats. I was sitting like 20 feet away from them or closer in a
Wow.
little club. And I would go there. And the next day I was playing music. And even walking out, I was so inspired. I had a completely different feeling. And I'm sure, even today, going to a concert and hearing somebody, and, I can imagine, never gone to a Stevie Wonder concert, but I can imagine sitting with 5 or 10,000 other people, which is probably how it happens at the Square Garden. And just, his music is so exciting and so centering,
Yeah.
you want to dance, but you also want to just smile.
Yeah, I'm smiling. I'm having a reaction to it. Yeah, absolutely. I can imagine that that would be unbelievable to be able to do that, or even be around thousands of people. On a different level, this other dimension, to have so many thousands of people together to be feeling something similar to each other because of the tone of music or rhythm or wanting to move and wanting to dance. And it's really incredible. It's really an incredible
Yeah,
experience.
well, that's the other thing, the ability. If I can remember going to hear the Gypsy Kings, it's so rhythmic and so it's enlivening. I can remember being at a performance with a large crowd, and everybody was just, sort of one big movement in concert. Everybody's with the music. Somebody can play something, and you can end up having tears rolling down your face.
Yep. Oh yeah, or getting chills. Many of us can experience goosebumps. I know for me, I can definitely feel, I have a whole reaction depending on what I'm listening to. And it's amazing how your body can physically react to sound like music, and how it affects your brain and, yeah, your system, your whole system, your nervous system.
People talk more about the brain than, you can feel it in the back of your neck. You can feel it in the back of your legs, in your feet. All of a sudden your feet are moving. And who moved my feet?
Right?
My feet are moving.
Right. All of a sudden you notice yourself dancing to a song. Even yesterday I went and saw live jazz yesterday.
Really?
And oh yes, oh yeah, absolutely. I love live jazz. So I went and watched a group. Many talented individuals were kind of circling through. And I noticed myself, because I'm always kind of moving, but I noticed my feet and I was swaying. And I was like, I think I might be the only one doing this, but I can't help it because it's so beautiful to listen to them. They were very talented group of people. And and they were original songs, I think, mostly by this group. Just awesome stuff. So to be able to sit or stand, I was stand live in front of these individuals while they played a variety of instruments. There were all kinds of instruments there. And seeing people stop and freeze to listen and to watch, and to I was watching a little bit of how everyone was interacting, and they were looking at each other going, oh, look, see how he's playing this. And it was sweet to see. I really enjoyed it. It was great.
We're talking about music and its relationship to healing, but and listening to it, and how there's a kind of musical dimensions to our everything that we say and do, our movements. But just to bring it back down to where you're speaking about, I would encourage everybody in the world to play music of some kind, whether you
Hmm.
play rhythm, whether you play, guitar or piano or sax or trumpet. And don't say you don't have musical talent, because everybody can play music. Maybe not everybody can be Miles Davis or, Taylor Swift or whatever, but everybody can play music, and it's not that difficult to have fun doing it. It's not, you don't have to become, a student of the greatest music of Western, 20th century Western music. There are just some basic principles, and it doesn't take long to learn them. And if you want to get more sophisticated, you will. And if you stick around long enough, it just happens to you. But playing music is a wonderful healing thing. And at times I've had the privilege of doing music workshops with kids where I just have them, either I give them a rhythm instrument like 3 or 4 year olds, or I give them something like a plastic bottle, and I show them how they can make a rhythm or play it. And then we go around and everybody will play like each person will play a rhythm, and then we'd all play that rhythm, and then we'd stop, and the person would improvise a little poem. So we'd have the poem, and the next person, and they'd play their rhythm, and then we'd all play that rhythm, and then they'd say their poem. Pick anything up and start your hands.
Yeah.
You can do it.
Yeah.
Just experiment, listen, and it'll happen.
Yeah.
And the more you do it, the more joy you'll bring into your life.
That's such a nice message. I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's a perfect way to end because that was so beautifully said. And I agree. I think music can be healing for everyone, even if you feel like you're not very talented in whatever way. It doesn't matter. If you jump in and just do it, you will gain more from it than you know. And I think that that's a really beautiful message to leave with listeners and anyone who's listening
Yeah,
to
I
us
mean, I
today.
think about this. Look, we all read. Not only a small percentage of us write the
Mm.
books that we read. If you don't write, does that mean you shouldn't allow yourself the joy of the pleasure and then the experience of growth that you get from reading?
Mm.
Not everybody can be a professional musician and perform like you. Everybody can hum songs and keep beats. And a simple thing like that, watch the way it makes you feel next time you let yourself do it.
Right. Yeah. Just let go and do it. Why not? Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. K, today for speaking to me and sharing your experience and your expertise and how you were able to integrate these really beautiful conversations and topics around music and psychotherapy. And I just really appreciate your perspective. So thank you for sharing with us today. And I hope that we will speak soon again and maybe have another conversation about this again in the future.
Listen, I'm so happy that we found each other in Olympia. We had this chance to share with each other, and that hopefully others can benefit from listening to us explore these things.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. And everyone, thank you for joining us today. And I will see you next time. Bye.